As Russia's military assault of Ukraine is underway.
And to China, which has begun joint military drills around Taiwan.
Israel has unleashed one of its worst attacks on Gaza since the war began.
Let me update you on the fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Well, China has warned NATO against provoking confrontation over its ties with Russia.
Today, we all wake up in a world where peace is the exception, not the rule. The world is at war. This isn't a war like the world wars of the last century, but a situation of a series of conflicts that began because we've been building up to it for generations. In 2023, there were 183 documented conflicts around the world, the highest we've had since the peak era of proxy war conflicts in the height of the Cold War. For almost a century, we've lived under a world order that promised stability and predictability. It was an order built on the ashes of two devastating world wars, brought about by the systems and institutions put in place to uphold it and prevent similar catastrophes from happening again. This order has broken down as a result of a series of long-term factors that have come together to produce a state of chaos both internally within countries and externally between them to lead to where we are today. Wars historically have generally come about as a result of two opposing camps coming up against each other. On one side, there's a status quo camp, looking to keep the established order where they're normally on top. On the other side, there's a revisionist camp, feeling emboldened by their growing strength and the perceived weakness of the status quo to challenge the order and bring about change through force. We've gotten to a historical tipping point where those that want the order to change not only have the means to act on that, but also consider the established order one that is no longer worth adhering to after decades of degradation. The reason the world is at war, including the revising of lines drawn on the map by past European empires, the rising power of non-state actors, the internet's role in exacerbating conflict, and the historical cycles that have tied everything together, have all played with and against each other to result in what we now see. None of these factors and the consequences that stem from them exist in a vacuum, and in order to truly understand how we've gotten here, one needs to understand their individual role in bringing about this state and the way that they have led to the larger historical trends that are unfolding. To truly begin to unpack how the world order collapsed to lead to the state of chaos we're in, we need to go back to the start and truly understand how the previous order actually came to be. One of the most popular books of the 2010s was called Sapiens, where the author stated that never before has peace been so prevalent that people couldn't even imagine war. That feeling was a result of what he called the global liberal order, which came about after the Second World War as the US set up a complex system of global alliances and institutions and positioned itself as the guarantor of global stability by being the largest military and economic power around. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, the United Nations was set up to mediate conflicts between nations, several institutions like the World Bank and the IMF were created, and the specter of nuclear bombs had raised the stakes of an all-out great power war to become an existential battle in a way that war had never been thought of before. The initial order that came out after the Second World War was different to the one that we've been used to for the past 30 years, because that one had the presence of the Soviet Union as another great power in the system, with it often being referred to as a bipolar order. The Soviet Union was much smaller in relative economic might and cultural influence to the US. Because of their sheer size, military capabilities, and recent expansion into Eastern Europe, combined with their communist ideology presenting an existential threat to America's way of life though, the world was a bipolar system with two, albeit unequal, powers at the top standing above the others. That remained the case for around 45 years, until the fall of the USSR in 1991 marked the end of that system as the global order became unipolar, with the US as its sole superpower. The collapse of the Soviet Union as a state, which was essentially a multi-ethnic empire, and the way it happened, was a huge moment in history. It was a relatively bloodless revolution that led to its fall, but it was also that lack of initial bloodshed that planted the seeds for future conflicts that we see today, not just involving Russia, but other states in the Union. With America being the sole superpower left, and liberal democracies being seen as the objective best form of governance, it seemed like we had reached the end of history. From now on, it looked like every country was going to be moving towards becoming a liberal democracy and enjoying the fruits of capitalism as a result of the global liberal order. The end of history and America's unchallenged position at the top, though, wouldn't last forever, and things started to change after 9/11. At the time, it wasn't entirely clear to see how, but the attack on New York marked the start of a new era in multiple different ways. It was the first sign of non-state actors being powerful enough in the international system to not only defend their operations like the drug cartels or repel larger powers in their own territory, like during the Cold War, but to actually strike a blow to the American mainland. In the years that followed, the countries that made up the system with its hierarchy of nations were fundamentally changing. Europe had less of a relative share of the global economy than it had done in decades. China had raised more than 100 million people out of poverty and was showing growth rates of around 10% per year for almost 20 years. People from Middle Eastern nations were rising against their established power structures in the Arab Spring. Countries like India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and a rebuilt Russia started to become more significant. The exact moment that the old order broke down is something people will probably only really settle on in hindsight. What that exact moment was is ultimately irrelevant, but the outcome is what we have today, the world at war. The reasons for this are varied in size and scope, and we can trace some of the most important ones back to well before the previous order was even established. Over hundreds of years, European empires carved up their continent and the world into lands they controlled. The formal process of decolonization started at the end of the First World War, and it only really finished with the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1991. The territorial disputes that countries are fighting over now, almost everywhere around the world, are almost entirely based on lines drawn when European empires were around and stuck to when they left. That's the case for the majority of conflicts in Africa, where lines were drawn with colonies rather than local populations in mind, which has led to not only wars between nations, but especially to wars within nations to determine which groups of people come out on top. That's the case in Asia, whether in the Kashmir region left undecided as the British left the Indian subcontinent, the Nagorno-Karabakh region where Armenia and Azerbaijan have been at war on and off since they became independent, or the series of conflicts across the Middle East, the borders of which were drawn up between the British and the French after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, not to mention the European support for the creation of the State of Israel and everything that has resulted from that. It is even the case in Europe itself, where Russia and Ukraine are now fighting over territory, and one could even say Ukraine's legitimacy as a state, based on lines that were drawn and redrawn during the time that both countries were in the Soviet Union. Some people can argue that the rise of populist authoritarian leaders are the cause of the rising tensions that led to these conflicts, and they may well have been the root of the triggers, but the seeds for all of them were planted at a time when the world was dominated by European empires. The thing about this mess is that there's no clear right way to settle it, and there is no objective right answer as to what borders should look like. Whether the world is best organized as fewer, larger states based on reason and practicality, or whether it's best split as thousands of independent ethno-states based on people's shared identity with their ethnicities, or anywhere along that spectrum, is a question with no defined answer that pleases everybody. Since there is subjectivity, and since there are large differences in the power that different groups hold at different times in history, there are always going to be those who see themselves as winners and those who see themselves as losers from the outcomes. As we mentioned right at the start, wars erupt between two states like these because one side is trying to uphold the status quo while the other side is trying to revise it. For pretty much all of history, this has held up, but the current state of affairs is less predictable. states have pretty much always had a monopoly on violence within their territory, where the state is the only actor that can bring about wars. One lesson that the last few decades has taught us, though, is that that monopoly no longer stands, and other players can no longer be dismissed. For the past decade, it's been common to see crime kill far more people than armed conflicts. In 2017, almost 500,000 people across the world were killed in homicides, almost 5 times as many as those who were killed in armed conflicts and terrorist attacks that year. Criminal groups take advantage of political instability and commodity shortages caused by past conflicts to establish themselves within society. Organized crime, both national and transnational, has grown as a result. These are increasingly driving conflict, especially in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and the Sahel, and have been long-standing players in different forms in Latin America, fomenting the drug trade. The rise of non-state actors has its roots decades ago, from the liberation movements for countries fighting for independence, through to proxy war battles during the Cold War, when these factions were funded by the opposing superpower to the one that was backing the group they were fighting against. In Afghanistan, several different groups armed themselves to oppose first the Soviet and later the US occupation of the country. Colombia has been at war against guerrilla fighters and drug cartels for decades, as has Mexico with the latter. Across Africa, from Burkina Faso to Somalia, several armed groups are fighting against government forces or each other. You need only scroll down the list of armed factions in the Syrian civil war to see the sheer volume of different groups involved in that conflict. The problem with non-state actors getting involved in wars against actual states is that it throws any kind of conventional wisdom out of the window. They add another aspect to wars that are separate from the goals of the states, and are often in direct opposition to them. They often act irrationally and have no remorse for getting civilians in the way of conflict if they think it'll help them achieve their goals. The rise of these groups and the potential power they could gather can change the whole calculation of a country's war aims, as well as the reason for and scope of their involvement in the first place. At around the time that the end of history was written, a different book titled The Clash of Civilizations was also published, where Huntington predicted that wars would move away from the ideological lens they had had since the start of the Russian Revolution to move towards more existential battles where people's cultural and religious identities would be the primary source of conflicts. Non-state actors holding the power that they have today is ultimately a manifestation of that, with most of these groups fighting for causes that go well beyond what would normally be a state's national objective. These groups have had and will continue to have a large involvement not only in participating in conflicts that break out, but starting them in the first place. And they have played a large role in breaking down the established internal order of many states around the world. A further factor that's been causing its own kind of internal damage is one that people don't tend to consider as much, which ties into all the others at once and disguises itself in plain sight, which we all access every day. It's rarely considered a standalone cause for wars breaking out, but the role that the internet has played in amplifying conflict and causing internal division through social media and technological developments is an aspect that can't be ignored in the modern world. If you really want to understand the core reasons behind that, you need to look at the evolution of media over time, as well as the nature of the algorithms inherent to the internet today. One fascinating insight I got while I was looking into this was about the rise of European nationalism in the masses in the late 1700s. Among factors including the development of local dialects and the death of the divine monarch in the cultural imagination, the emergence of mass-produced newspapers came along to unite countrymen with a shared experience and worldview. Nationalism essentially became a surrogate religion and spread through the world in the 2 centuries that followed, leading to the breakup of empires and the creation of several nation-states that didn't exist prior. These all came about through wars, either between countries, within countries, or against occupying powers. Over the past 2 decades, social media has become the main form of media that the masses consume, and the algorithms they have in place have served to fuel the fire of conflicts in a different way. Not only the goal, but the entire business model of pretty much every single social media platform is to keep users on their platform for as long as possible so they can sell spaces on there to advertisers. We're talking about companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars, where the main thing they're after is attention. And they've been able to get scientific with how to do that. To keep people on for longer, they know that they have to serve them what they want to see. That means that whatever view you hold, which their predictive AI is able to identify through millions of data points they collect as you scroll through your newsfeed, will be the view that gets served to you. More than that though, they know that to really get people invested in keeping up with and following something, they need to serve extremes. They need to take the furthest outliers on any side of any spectrum and put them front and central for the bulk of people to see, so it can cause outrage on both sides and subsequently keep people on there for longer. What this has caused over the last 20 years is an emotionally charged polarization of society driven by pixels on screens. Non-state actors commonly find their recruits and communicate with them directly on social media platforms. The terrible realities of war are being live-streamed for humanity to keep up with for the first time in history. More than anything though, it has led to a weakening of society internally, especially across the West, which has consequences both domestically and globally for these countries. The thing about the internet is that although we all have access to the same information sources, not only do we also have access to false information, but we're often only showed one side of the story, an often extreme version of the side that we would inherently lean towards believing because of the views we hold. As a result of that, especially in the West and other regions with uncensored internet access, there has been a disagreement within society about the key issues that societies need to be aligned on. Any given presidential election is suddenly painted like an existential battle between two sides with completely different visions for the future of the country. People clash over the most trivial things as if they're life and death scenarios. The notion of the future being better than the present, which was a driving force for most of human history, is no longer one that is universally shared. There is no longer a set of common values that ties everyone in a society together, and at that point, society is weak as a whole. This has happened across the Western world, who are the status quo powers that uphold the current order. The revisionist powers who want to change things have seen this, and it's no coincidence that they have felt emboldened to challenge the order when they see infighting domestically over these kinds of issues. The development of the internet and the evolution of technology has also led to a completely different conceptualization of war itself. Cyber attacks, hacks, bots, and ransomware can cause more economic damage than most missiles in the past. Cheaply assembled drones can take out military equipment worth tens of billions of dollars. The exposure of extremist events can influence the people who they're being live-streamed to. Refugees coming from existing conflicts, particularly into Europe and America, are being used not only as tools of war, but as an instrument of polarization for the populations of these countries. The crazy thing is, as much as everything has changed with the development of technologies and the presence of the internet, the cyclical nature of history and the recurring trends that have happened over time are still as relevant today as they always have been. And, according to some, we could just be looking at the end of one big cycle and the beginning of a new one. The times ahead will be radically different to those in our lifetimes, though similar to ones we've seen before. How do I know that? Because they always have been. That's how Ray Dalio starts off his video on the changing world order, a 45-minute deep dive where he goes into the topics he covers in his book of the same title that I'll leave linked in the description. His thesis is that the rise and fall of leading empires and the world orders that follow are cyclical, and all of them share common traits in their rise, time at the top, and fall, so much so that you can use metrics and criteria to predict when the next stages of the cycle will come. As we alluded to, he claims that the current world order, which he calls the American order, formed after the Allied victory in World War II, when the US emerged as the dominant world power. Naturally, given his field of work as the founder of one of the world's largest hedge funds, his analysis looks more at the economic factors that lead to the world order, looking at the dollar as the reserve currency being the biggest factor in bringing about the American order, the same way that the British pound was before it and the Dutch currency before that. He calls the changes that take place the big cycle, where each one lasts around 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them, which often involve periods of great conflict because leading powers don't go down without a fight. He sees the US currently being in its post-peak stage, where it's on the decline part of its own curve, with China seen as the rising power to take its place. His full explanation is worth a watch, and I won't be able to do it justice in this video, but his views on internal and external conflicts are worth exploring, as are his predictions on where things will head. Dalio claims that internal conflicts come about as a result of excessive borrowing to fuel growth and the self-reinforcing wealth gaps between the richest in society and the bulk of its members, which spills over into resentment and eventually conflict once the standard of living of the majority of the population starts declining as a result of the rising cost of living. The impact of the internet in making this more visible to the bulk of the population is something that's only going to exacerbate this, and his analysis shows that it inevitably leads to revolution. This could be peaceful, like FDR's revolution that stopped the Great Depression in the 1930s, or it can spill over into civil war, like the French, Russian, or Chinese revolutions in the past. The core outcome of any of these revolutions is a basic redistribution of wealth and a new internal order that serves more people than the previous one, which isn't necessarily inherently violent. The other arena of war is the international arena, where China, in this case, as the rising power, has built up its economic and military strength to challenge the US in what it considers its own sphere of influence. The logic goes that as the revisionist power sees the internal weakness in the status quo power, they are more inclined to mount a challenge. This raises the risk of having a large-scale international conflict, especially if the rival has built up a comparable military. China has their own domestic issues they're dealing with, whether that's their terrible demographic situation and incoming population collapse, their severe house price bubble, or the increasingly authoritarian handling of societal discontent that has ramped up over the past years. That potential conflict and the theory of the Thucydides trap, which assesses whether a rising power and the current power are destined to go to war, is a separate video that we'll have to make at some point down the line. So if you're interested in that one, and if you're enjoying this one so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with the next videos we have coming your way. To look at what is actually the reason for wars taking place today though, America's big cycle and the theory of it coming to an end is the big question. Mark Twain once wrote that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And although our current era holds more differences from the decades that came before it than the differences between different centuries for most of history, there are many aspects that mirror past phases. Whether that's the lead up to the fall of the Roman Republic, Weimar Germany, the French Revolution, or the 17th century, there are many parallels that can be seen between our era and previous times of great unrest leading to war. I'll also leave a video by another creator I really like called What If Alt Hist, who does a deep dive into some of the parallels that is well worth the watch, linked in the description, where he goes much deeper into these similarities and the takeaways from them. With all of that being said, Warren Buffett once said, "Never bet against America," and it's for good reason. It got to where it is because it's a resource-rich, continentally sized country born with an entrepreneurial spirit, with no powerful neighbors, and has built the largest economy and most powerful military the world has ever seen. America's internal weakness as a hegemonic power has most certainly played a role in the current state of the world, and what that will ultimately result in is a new world order with maps being redrawn, spheres of influence being reconsidered, and the balance of power fundamentally shifting. Regardless of what that new order will come to look like, it's hard to imagine America won't have a very privileged place within it. Whether we look at the territorial disputes, the historical cycles the world goes through, the role that non-state actors now play in war, or the role that the internet has played in bringing about the current state of the world, two things seem pretty clear. The order we once knew is dead, and there is not yet a new one to replace it. Where there is no order, there is chaos by definition, and a state of war in some shape or scale is always going to be the result of that. While I was studying international relations in university, where I finished in 2020, there was already a lot of talk of the world system going from a unipolar order with the US as its sole superpower to a multipolar order with various big players who balance each other out. And it looks like we've gotten to a point where that is becoming a reality. The world is at war because the existing order was perceived to be weak enough for the revisionist powers to challenge it. These powers, whether they be Russia, Azerbaijan, Venezuela, China, Boko Haram, or any of the others involved in or considering starting conflicts today, see it as more advantageous to risk fighting to revise the status quo than to adhere to it. If you couple the factors we mentioned with the consequences of climate change, mass migrations, population collapses, and rising levels of populism, not to mention developments in AI and other technologies and the roles that these play in the collective imagination we have of the future, the collapse of the global liberal order, or the American world order, has already happened, and the current state will continue to be one of chaos until a new order comes about to replace it. What many doomsayers fail to consider, though, is that after all is said and done, and once a new order is in place, there is a lot of hope for better times to come. What we're seeing today is the unraveling of the international conflict control architecture that has supported global stability, restraint, and transparency for the past 80 years. The world is at war because the old order has broken down, and new conflicts will continue popping up until a new order is eventually established in its place. Post-war periods tend to be the biggest booms in history across multiple different facets. For all the pain and destruction the 2020s could bring, at some point down the line, part of the 2030s has the potential to be a golden time for civilization and the advancement of humanity across the board. History is cyclical, and if the collapse of previous cycles and the subsequent booms are anything to go by, as much as things may look bad today, the hope for a better tomorrow is always still there. Definitely a heavy one to put out there, but one that I thought was important given the general emotional reactions and lack of understanding for things playing out the way that they have been. Since you stuck around to the end, you'll probably also enjoy this video we made on the American military-industrial complex and how it came to be. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to keep up to date with all the next ones we have coming your way. We're still just getting started and there's a whole lot more to come. I'll see you next time.